Hi, my name is Callie Wright, and I'm the Education Director at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. We're the nonprofit that was founded by a Vietnam veteran. We're responsible for founding the Vietnam Veterans Memorial down on the National Mall. And today, we work to educate folks about the Vietnam War and era, and also honor those who served. I'm really excited today because I'm joined by my good friend and Vietnam veteran, Michael McMahon. Michael has the incredibly important role of also being a volunteer down at the wall on the National Mall. He's what we affectionately refer to as a yellow hat. Now, yellow hats you'll certainly recognize because they are completely dressed in yellow, or rather their yellow top, but also they're there to help you find names on the wall. And they're also there to maybe teach you a thing or two about the memorial or share a story with you. Michael is also a volunteer at the New Jersey Vietnam Veterans Memorial, where he currently resides. Michael is going to talk to me today about a subject that is incredibly important, the draft. So first, I just want to say thank you, Michael, so much for talking with me, and welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for asking me to participate, to join you.
Absolutely. Well, we're really excited that you're here. The first question that I have for you is, I want to set a little bit of a scene. I want to know, what were you doing when you got drafted? What was your job? Had you gone to college? What were you and your friends doing, or perhaps you and your girlfriend? Tell me a little bit about that.
When I was drafted, I had finished college. I graduated from college in June of 1968. I was working. I was working for Merrill Lynch and Company. I had worked for the company through college. And on graduation, I had difficulty trying to find a job because I, at that point, had lost my draft status and became 1A and was eligible for the draft. So looking for a career was basically hit the pause button. So I stayed at Merrill Lynch on a full-time basis, and I was just waiting for the draft notice to come. I knew it was going to be coming in not too distant future. At the time, Dolores and I were engaged. I'm really lucky person. I became engaged and married my high school sweetheart. We've been married for 51, going on 52 years now.
Awesome. And how did you learn that you had been asked to serve?
I received a letter in the mail. Now, the letter is, and I often say to students, you can Google and come up with the draft letter. It's the same draft letter that millions of men who were drafted during the Vietnam era received. I have a copy of mine, and I want to show it for two reasons. I know you can't read it, but there were two things that are distinct about it. One is the date. The letter begins and it says, "Greeting. You are hereby ordered for induction to the Armed Forces of the United States." Mine happens to be dated December 24th, 1968, Christmas Eve. So I received some cards that week that had the word greeting on it, but they were generally season's greeting, not the one that I received from my uncle. The other thing that I find interesting about it is, and it's hard to see, but in the corner of the letter is a New York City subway token. Back in the 1960s, the New York City Transit Authority used subway tokens to be able to buy a fare. And the draft board was noted that if they needed you for a physical or some sort of test, they would send you a letter, and in the envelope, they would scotch tape 2 subway tokens. And when you received the letter, you would feel the letter. And if you felt 2 subway tokens, you knew you were okay because they wanted you down, but they were sending you home that night. When you got the letter that ordered you to report, there was only 1 subway token in the letter, and that meant you were drafted. So that's how, young men in New York City basically learned about the draft.
What part of New York City were you living in at the time?
I was born and raised in Brooklyn and lived there for many years before I moved out of the city. But I'm a Brooklyn kid.
Awesome. Did you know anyone at the time that had been drafted?
I did. At the time, if you think of a group of friends, think of your friends from high school, your friends from college. Um, what happened was the group that we hung out with, if I could use that term, from high school on, one got drafted, was gone in the military for a couple of years, came back, somebody else went in. It was, sort of constant that there was somebody either ready to go in or had just come home. And when I graduated high school, and I put in context this because it does affect how I looked at the draft. When I was in high school, Vietnam wasn't on the radar screen. It wasn't an issue. Generally, those men who got drafted were sent to Germany or South Korea. Now, they were pretty stressful tours of duty. We were in Germany. We were, if I could say, eyeball to eyeball with the Russians with nuclear weapons. We had just gone through the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cold War was at a height. So it was pretty difficult duty, but it was in Germany. When I graduated high school that summer, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred. And so during college, the draft increased and the number of men in Vietnam increased. By sophomore year, when I graduated high school, there were 15,000. When I was a sophomore in college, there were 200,000. Junior year, it hit 300,000. Senior year, it hit 500,000. So what happened was it escalated around me. And certainly in college, the draft became more of an issue than it did in high school.
How did you feel about being drafted?
Growing up in the 50s and 60s, I was a child of the greatest generation. Around my neighborhood, the men who were my role models had all served. My father served in World War II. There was an expectation. The draft was not a Vietnam phenomena. It began with World War I and the registration for the draft. When I think of my mother and father, both my mother and father were born before World War I broke out. They were born in 1911 and 1913. Their life was shaped by the influence of World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and I think a commitment to service. When you get called, you serve. And I think there was an expectation on my part that eventually I would be called and I would serve. So there was never a feeling of anything but, that's my responsibility. By the way, elected, and it was a conscious decision. I decided not to join the military. I had waited to be drafted. I explored joining the military, but the military wasn't what I looked at as career for myself. The other thing is that draftees serve 2 years of active duty, where people who voluntarily join generally were responsible for 3 to 4 years of active duty. And when I was 21, 3 years was an eternity. So I allowed myself to be drafted.
How did your family feel about you being drafted? Did you have siblings? How did they feel about that?
I did. I do have siblings. I'm one of 5 children. My father was a pressman for a newspaper for the New York Daily News and a union worker. My mother was a stay-at-home mom with the 5 of us. I think my father had a sense of pride, but he understood the risks being a veteran, and I think there was a nervousness about it. The things that about Vietnam that strike me, especially for like my dad, we didn't talk a lot about it, but I asked my brother a little bit about my dad's reaction when I was in Vietnam and what it was like. And one of the things that bothered him was more so those that were not serving. He saw the inequalities or the inequities in the draft, people who weren't drafted. And there was a big sense of how can this son of, say, somebody who was influential or a politician not be serving and my son have to serve. And I think it was more you had a draft card that gave you your status, but people didn't know what your status was. And, people who had physical limitations and couldn't serve, they could be walking the streets just as somebody who's 1A ready to serve. And I guess when you have when it's your son that's in the game, you want to know why others are not in the game. So he was really troubled by that. He also pointed out, my brother pointed out to me sometimes, the insensitive of other people talking to my father. I served with the 9th Infantry Division in the Mekong Delta of Vietnam. And I was in what we called 4 Corps. And there was one particular friend who my father had, he would talk to regularly, who would always tell him, oh, I was reading how bad the action was down in the Delta, your son's at risk, and, my father would be really upset, but couldn't say to him, it's just the insensitive of other people talking to him. But I think there was a true sense of pride on his part of my service. I remember when I come home specifically, and when I came home, I was a sergeant and I had my ribbons on and all. And I remember how proud he was of my service.
When you started training after you were drafted, where were you sent in the US?
I was sent to Columbia, South Carolina, to Fort Jackson. And just to touch upon the training part of it, the training, basic combat training is BCT, as they call it, is an 8-week program. And it basically teaches you how to march, how to fire a rifle, how to do some medical, how to bandage a wound and treat a wound if you need to. But it's really basic stuff. When they say basic training, it's 8 weeks of basic training. But before you go to basic training, you spend 1 week at an area called a reception station. And when I went to Fort Jackson, I was a New Yorker. I thought I was going down south to the warm weather. I went to Fort Jackson and it was 11 degrees. I froze. South Carolina, my welcome to South Carolina wasn't what I expected my welcome to South Carolina to be. It was damn cold. And I wasn't prepared for that. The other thing was they were at the height where lots of men were being drafted, and the Army was opening old facilities to sort of house them. The barracks I was assigned to for my reception station week was an old World War II barrack, and that day a 2.5-ton truck, a deuce and a half as we called them, hit the corner of the barracks and knocked the corner out. So we had the cold air blowing in. We had a potbelly stove that we put coal in to try to give us some warmth. And that was my introduction to the military. The other thing that happened that day it was a day of first for me, and certainly a first that I was in South Carolina, but it was the first time I was ever on a plane. I had never flown before. And today, flying is, except for the last year during the pandemic, flying is very commonplace for everybody, no matter their age. But I was 21 years old. It was the first time I was on an airplane. So there was a lot of firsts for me that day. But basic training was spent at Fort Jackson, South Carolina.
Can you speak a little bit about your relationship with the woman who eventually became your wife and is still your wife, Dolores, and how being drafted and going to Vietnam changed that?
I think if anything, it made it stronger, the relationship stronger. When I was drafted, when I was out of college, we planned on getting married. We were engaged before I left on the draft. We knew I had a leave after 16 weeks, which from January would bring it to May. And we wanted to get married before wherever my orders were. Like we knew there was a high probability of Vietnam, but there was also probabilities of other places as well. But the commitment was we're going to get married. So we set a date based on the calendar as best we could judge it, and it was May 17th, 1969. And we went forward. What I will say, we burnt up a lot, we used a lot of change in the telephone. You know, there were no cell phones or emails or anything like that. You basically wrote letters and you connected on the telephone. So used a lot of dimes, dropped a lot of dimes, if I could put it that way. And you know, we were close, but it was you know, maybe tested, if it might be a word. We were separated, but we were committed, and you know, we got married that May 17th. Even it wasn't until the end of my advanced training. I went through advanced training for infantry. They called Advanced Infantry Training, AIT, and it wasn't until I finished that I had gotten my orders. Right around the time I finished, there was an incident in South Korea. In South Korea was we had a lot of troops stationed, but they weren't it wasn't hot, so to speak. We were in combat at the time, and there was an incident in South Korea and between North and South Korea, and the entire infantry class the Friday before that graduated the week before ours was redirected to South Korea. And I just had my fingers crossed that, you know, I'll take South Korea as opposed to South Vietnam, but it didn't happen.
Is that when you found out then that you would be going to South Vietnam?
It was when I finished advanced infantry training, received my next orders, I found I was going to South Vietnam.
When you got to Vietnam, was there a divide between folks who had been drafted and folks who hadn't?
No, I didn't feel it. I didn't sense that. The only difference was our service numbers or serial numbers were different. Mine was US 52777-327. Remember it as today. It's on my dog tag, but remember it. I'll never forget it. But it began with the letters US, which meant that I had been drafted. The people who had signed up for the military were RA, regular Army, and their serial numbers began with two different letters. Other than that, I didn't sense any difference whatsoever among those that were drafted and those that joined, or at least in my unit. You know, this is an excellent point to me, at least. We've been talking for a few minutes now, and I'm telling you my story. And I think what I always try to do is encourage people to speak to as many veterans, Vietnam veterans, as they can, because each story is different. My story was, we didn't really experience any differences between the RAs and the US. So.
Yeah. Well, and I know, you know, something we always say is there is no one Vietnam War or even Vietnam era story. You know,
Right.
everyone's experience is so different and so unique, which is why I agree. It's so incredibly important to speak to a variety of folks. So my next question is, in 1969, we moved away from the draft boards. You know, the draft boards, these are the little groups of neighbors, right, who sit
Right.
and kind of made the decisions. And
Right.
we moved to a lottery, which, you know, was sold as a more kind of a pick the birthdays out of the bowl, and a more randomized situation. And then in 1973, the draft completely ends and has not returned to this day. So you are someone who experienced or who has bore witness to all forms of the draft in that way. What do you think about these shifts?
I think the shift to the lottery was a very positive shift. There were some inherent inequities in the draft, and uh, even if they weren't real, they were perceived. And I think the lottery took that away. My current day comparison is my COVID-19 shot. I know that you're not going to find a parallel here, but I have one. And that is, I've signed up to get my shot. And fortunately, my name has finally come up and I'm going to be able to get a vaccine next week. The only thing is, for weeks went by and friends' names came up or people I know, or they got a shot, but it was in this black box. And it was, how did they get it and I didn't? And I know other people have said the same thing about me. How did you get a date, but I didn't? I'm the same age, I'm the same physical condition. Um, and I think the draft was a little bit like that. It's how come you're exempt and I'm not. And I think there were a lot of inequities that were perceived and that were real. And I think the lottery took that away. I think the nature, as far as the elimination of the draft, I think the nature of the military changed, how we fight wars, technology changed. And fortunately, we don't need to supplement. And really what the draft was doing was supplementing the gaps where we couldn't fill the need, people were drafted. And I think that we don't have that gap any longer. We have enough people, fortunately, who are serving and sacrificing for us.
All right, Michael, is there anything that I didn't ask you specifically that you want to say about the draft?
No, I think we've covered a lot of aspects of it, and I think that covers that point.
Awesome. Well, once again, I want to say my name is Callie Wright, and I'm the education director at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. We are the nonprofit that founded the wall, and we're also working today to educate folks about the Vietnam War and era and honor those who served. I'm joined today by my friend Michael McMahon, who is a Vietnam veteran and a volunteer, both here at the wall in DC and at the New Jersey Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Michael, I'm super thankful that you agreed to talk to me today, and I've learned a lot about the draft, and I hope other folks found some good stuff too. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.